This is the untold story of the making of the modern world. A fresh perspective, charting the spread of civilization across the globe. From the dawn of mankind and the first cities and empires, to the belief in one God. We follow the flow of civilization from the Middle East, an extraordinary place that has been a vital link between the continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe for millennia. An economic, scientific, and cultural center of the world. This is an epic journey of discovery. From the east to the west. Istanbul, the only city in the world that sits astride two continents, Europe and Asia. This was once the capital of one of the greatest imperial powers in history, the vast Ottoman Empire. As the dream of a great dynasty became a reality, the Ottoman Sultanate developed into a Renaissance superpower. The dynamism and sophistication of their court at Topkapı Palace inspired both fear and fascination in the empire and beyond. In its golden age, the Ottoman Empire would become invincible both on land and sea. Revered as the model for state, trade, and culture.
İnanılmaz bir şey. İki yönden. Bir inanmış bir insan olarak, ikincisi de bir mimar olarak.
But a tide of change threatened to bring the age of empire crashing to a close.
There's a real quantum shift in the 19th century. You get the sense that they realise they cannot survive unless they start to face outwards.
It was a time when relations with the West would shape the East. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire and the West. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire expanded across three continents. The Ottomans controlled much of Western Asia, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. At the head of the ruling Ottoman dynasty was Sultan Suleiman, known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent. (1529). The 300,000-strong Ottoman war machine has pushed its way to the gates of Vienna. Suleiman has shaken Christian Europe to its core. It is a watershed moment in history. But after months of siege, Vienna's defenders prevail. The prolonged siege and upcoming winter forced the Sultan to change his mind. But, although their advance may have been checked at Vienna, the Ottomans were still a permanent fixture in Europe. And within the empire, their wealth and potency seemed unaffected. One priceless object in Topkapi Palace epitomizes the extent of Suleiman's power.
Bu obje Kanuni Sultan Süleyman'ın kılıçlarından birisi, kendi adını taşıyan. Üzerindeki işçilik kendi dönemini yansıtan rafine, ince işçilik. Sade ama çok şık, çok kalite işçilik. Üzerinde ünvanlar oluyor. Bazen dualar olabilir, bazen şiir olabilir ama genellikle ünvan yazar. Padişahın kendine ait kılıçların üzerinde. Sultan Süleyman Şah bin Selim Şah şeklinde devam ediyor. Gerçi yazın ucu biraz silinmiş, biraz değil, bir hayli silinmiş ama başlangıcından anlıyorsunuz ünvanını.
Made almost 500 years ago, this sword could have been carried in a court ceremony by Suleiman himself as a display of royal splendor. This sword shows that Suleiman could obtain the finest resources and attract the most talented craftsmen from both inside and outside the empire.
Genellikle dıştan geliyor. Kıymetli taşlar dışarıdan geliyor. Yana rubi, yani yakut taşı diyoruz. Yakut genellikle işte Hindistan'dan, Burma gibi ya da Hindistan gibi yerlerden geliyor. Firuze, İran'ın Firuz kentinden geliyor. Türkçe'de onun için Firuze. Ama batıda turkuaz, yani Türk mavisi olarak anılır.
This parchment map was made around 1560 for Sultan Suleiman by cartographer Al-Hajj Abul Hassan. The Ottoman flags flying over places like Belgrade, Buda, and Rhodes show that despite the setback at Vienna, much of Europe was now under Ottoman control. And it was not only on land that the Ottomans had been interfering in European concerns. Now Suleiman's navy became the scourge of the Christian West. Behind the scenes at Istanbul's Naval Museum is a restoration warehouse. Inside, it houses a unique bounty. Ottoman vessels kept under wraps. These are imperial caiques and galleys that once sailed the Black Sea and Mediterranean. The task of restoring them to their original glory has begun. They are relics of a time when the Ottomans were known by friend and foe alike as the Lords of the Sea.
Orijinal olarak günümüze kadar kalabilen en eski ve dolayısıyla tek kadırga örneği üzerindeyiz. 16. yüzyıldan kalma bir kadırga örneği bu. Akdeniz tarihi çalışanların üzerinde heyecan duymaması imkansız olan bir örnek bu. Oturaklarımız var. 3 kişilik oturaklar, her kanatta 24 oturak ve toplam 144 tane kürekçi için yer var.
This was the age of discovery, a time when European states had begun to colonize the New World and trade spices as far afield as the Indian Ocean. Now Ottoman fleets attempted to monopolize the lucrative trade from the east. They captured strategic island and coastal outposts turning the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. To grasp control of the shipping lanes, the Ottomans employed an ingenious tactic. The countless pirates, privateers, and corsairs that roamed the seas were usually lawless raiders and traders. But by making shrewd and tactical alliances, Sultan Suleiman turned the most seaworthy corsairs into Ottoman admirals. This 16th century miniature shows the Sultan receiving the most successful privateer in Ottoman history. His name was Hayreddin Barbarossa.
Barbaros belki de 16. yüzyıl Avrupa'sının, sadece Akdeniz'inde değil Avrupa'sının en karizmatik figürlerinden bir tanesi. Ve Barbaros romanslarda, şiirlerde, duvar halılarında, şarkılarda, aklımıza şu anda gelmeyecek pek çok edebi janrda ölümsüzleştirilmiş bir kahraman.
Under Barbarossa's command, the Ottomans interrupted vital European seaborne trade. Cities all over Europe saw their livelihoods hang by a thread. Sixteenth century Europe may have been divided by internal rivalries, but they had a common enemy. The Ottomans were such a threat that Western Europe formed a holy league to defend themselves. Two of the largest navies ever assembled clashed off the coast of Greece at Lepanto.
Her zaman kırılma noktası gibi gösterilen bir tarih pek tabii Lepanto yani İnebahtı Savaşı'dır. Kıbrıs'ın Osmanlı eline geçmesinin akabinde büyük kuvvetlerin Papalık, İspanya ve Venedik olmak üzere bir ittifak oluşturarak artık bu sorunu tamamen çözme isteğidir. Tabii ki Osmanlı için büyük bir hezimetle sonuçlanır.
In the course of the battle, the Ottomans lost 4 times as many ships as the Europeans and doubled the troops. Lepanto was celebrated by the Holy League as a major victory. Now they hope to reclaim control of the Mediterranean. But most importantly, the idea that the Ottomans could be decisively beaten was born. In the West, this naval battle has traditionally been seen as a major turning point in the struggle against the Ottomans. But in the East, this was just a setback. Within a year, the Ottomans had rebuilt their fleet. Lepanto was far from the end of Ottoman power. In their relations with the Ottomans, Europe's mercantile powers walked a tightrope between alliance and defense. Ambassadors from Francis I's France and Elizabeth I's England were sent on diplomatic missions to the Ottoman court as treaties of friendship and commerce became essential to their survival. In this Ottoman miniature, King John Sigismund of Hungary is depicted paying homage to Suleiman. It reveals the continuing influence of the Ottomans upon the Western world.
Ne Avrupa'yı Osmanlı olmadan anlayabilirsiniz, ne Osmanlı'yı Avrupa olmadan anlayabilirsiniz. Ve bu sadece Kanuni dönemi için değil, kuruluşundan çöküşüne kadar bu böyledir. Avrupa kimliği biraz Türklere karşı, biraz Türklere taraf olarak inşa edilmiş bir kimliktir. Dolayısıyla birbirini var eden iki entiteden bahsediyoruz.
At Topkapı Palace, Western visitors discovered an imperial playground that could equal any European Renaissance court in riches, taste, and in the language of kingship. Their reports of the splendor of Suleiman's court earned him the title Suleiman the Magnificent. But perhaps Suleiman's greatest legacy was his creation of a system of government that the world still uses today.
Kanaatimce modern devletin ilk teşekkül ettiği, oluştuğu dönem Kanun'un 2. dönemidir. Modern devlete baktığımızda sürekli ordu, güçlü bir vergilendirme sistemi ve bunu yürüten güçlü bir bürokrasi. Bu Kanun'un 2. döneminde Osmanlı'da inşa edilmiştir ve modern Avrupa devletleri bunu kendi örnek alarak bildiğimiz modern ulus devletleri inşa etme sürecini başlatmıştır diyebiliriz.
Topkapı didn't just become a center of modern government. It became a model of artistic design. Here, the Ottomans drew together the different artistic styles of East and West and founded their own Ottoman means of expression. Even after Suleiman's time, later sultans built upon this tradition and endowed the palace grounds with ever more elaborate Ottoman designs. Today, a restoration team are replicating the work of Ottoman master craftsmen of the classical age.
Topkapı Sarayı'da yer alan çinlerin hepsi Osmanlı dönemine ait çok iyi örnekler. Şu anda daha önce tümlemesini yaptığımız orijinal çinlerin eksik alanlarının orijinal çiniyle birebir renklerine uygun şekilde tümlemesine yapıyoruz.
The Revan Pavilion was built in 1635 to celebrate the conquest of Yerevan, today the capital of Armenia. It represents a pinnacle of the Ottoman artistic legacy, fueled by continuing conquests. In the maturity of his reign, at the age of 54, Suleiman had reached the zenith of his powers. Now he wanted to leave a lasting and majestic impression upon Istanbul, a symbol of his reign for all the world to see. And he relied on a well-established genius. His name was Sinan. The chief architect of the empire for 50 years, Sinan had designed and supervised hundreds of Ottoman landmarks, from Damascus to the capital. Now Suleiman commissioned Sinan to build the tallest, most extensive complex in the history of the capital, the Süleymaniye Mosque. It is the ultimate expression of the power of the Ottoman state. Even today, its command of the city is breathtaking. As well as a mosque, Sinan designed 4 colleges here: a soup kitchen, a hammam, a caravanserai, and a hospital, as well as the tomb that would be Sultan Suleiman's final resting place. The Süleymaniye complex quickly became the focal point of the city.
Çok çeşitli bölgelerden insanlar, şehrin çeşitli noktalarından insanlar gelip cuma günleri burada topluca namaz kılıyorlar ve çıkışta da uzun zamandır görmedikleri arkadaşlarını, tanıdıklarını görüyorlar. Böylelikle herhalde hoş bir sohbet ve bir arada olma geçiyordu. Bu geçmişteki işte Grek kültüründeki agora, Roma kültüründeki forumların 16. 17. 18. yüzyıllardaki modern bir devamı. Mimaride bir yapı içine gelen ışıkla değerlendirilir. Yüksekliği, büyütü, boyu değil. Sinan yapıları gerçekten kubbeyle örtülen, eğrisel sistemle örtülen yapıların en aydınlık yapılarıdır. Mesela kilise yapılarında çok fazla insan kendini aciz hisseder üstünde. Şeffaf bir ışık düzeni görüyorsunuz. Burada bir metal tavan var gibi. O bize insan boyutunu hatırlatıyor. Biz onun altında ezilmiyoruz.
The conformity of intricate geometric shapes was the culmination of Sinan's lifelong effort to achieve a unified space, capturing in stone the ordered Ottoman view of the world.
Osmanlılarda nizam-ı alem, dünya düzeni kavramı var. Türkler nizam yani düzeni çok önemserler. Çok hızlı organize oluyorlar. Bu hızlı organizasyonu müthiş bir düzen içerisinde yapıyorlar ve pratik düşünüyorlar. Dolayısıyla sonuç alıcı iş yapıyorlar ve sonuç yaptıkları işin de sürekli olmasına çok dikkat ediyorlar.
Traditionally, the late 17th and 18th centuries are considered the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire. But in reality, the empire was thriving. The empire stretched across Africa, Asia and Europe, from Algiers to Mosul, and from Medina to the gates of Vienna. The Ottomans controlled the crossroads of trade routes coming from every continent and subcontinent between East and West. Ottoman merchants were prospering in the capital and the coastal provinces. The small town of Birgi in western Anatolia retains its Ottoman character today, and amidst the traditional houses is an echo of this time of plenty. Built in 1761, largely preserved in its original state, Çakırar Mansion seems at first sight to be a typical wooden mansion of Western Anatolia. This magnificent three-story building belonged to Şerif Aliyar, the owner of the local tannery. Yet the small details in the mansion's decor reveal that Şerif Aliyar's world extended far beyond Anatolia. Western motifs reflect the ideas carried into Ottoman harbours by the French, English, Dutch and Venetian traders that flowed in and out of Birgi. And there's a story hidden in the friezes of Çakırar Mansion. Şerif Aliyar's two wives, one from the vibrant capital Istanbul, and the other from the Aegean trading port of Izmir, were pining for their hometowns. A solution was found. As a comfort to them, Şerif Aliyar had their cities painted on their bedroom walls. Izmir in this room, Istanbul in this. Capturing in miniature what was the economic powerhouse of the empire, over 500 kilometers to the north. But the arrival of the modern age would present the Ottomans with new challenges, with pressure and influence from Europe penetrating all the way to Istanbul. The Ottoman elite began to change their outlook. If you travel along the Bosphorus in Istanbul today, you can still find clues as to how the Ottoman world was in transition.
The Bosphorus is a good example of how things are changing. By the 18th century, you have an explosion of the old center. The palace is no longer contained within the limits of the city. The sultanas, the palace, the sultan himself will start to use the Bosphorus as a place where you can flaunt and display your splendor by implanting these new kinds of mansions, seaside mansions.
The Ottomans began to build elaborate Western-style architecture along the shore of the Bosphorus.
If you look at some of these mansions, they're generally built so as to enjoy the scenery of the Bosphorus. The rest, that is the backside, is used as a huge garden where you would have your harem and whatever, but the stately mansion would be right on the sea. And that's a way of enjoying the city that did not exist previously.
This new pleasure culture was not only promoted by the Ottoman elite. More and more European diplomats retired to grand new waterfront embassies.
The Bosphorus has become a grand canal. If you take Venice as an example, this is a huge canal where people are basically expressing their power by their residences and by their sheer presence on this stretch of water.
This grand waterway is the age-old dividing line between the continents of Europe and Asia. It has been an important trade route since ancient times. Now, as European trade with the Americas began to eclipse the old Mediterranean markets, a new world order was emerging.
If you look at the 18th century, you already have a sense of a society that is changing. The Mediterranean is being marginalized. That is true of the Ottomans. It's also true of Venice. It's also true of the Spaniards. What is rising is the Atlantic economies. It's the Dutch, the English, to a certain extent the French. So the world is changing. The balance of the world is changing. And in that new world, the Ottomans feel they no longer have a hold on modernity, on what is happening.
Ever since the French Revolution in 1789, the spark of nationalism within the empire had been fanned into flame. In a newly industrialized world, a great wave of radical social and political unrest was building momentum. With the backing of European powers, the empire's non-Muslim minorities demanded independence from the Ottoman state. And in 1827, disaster struck. In support of the Greek battle for independence, Britain, France, and Russia completely annihilated the Ottoman fleet in the Battle of Navarino. Nationalism had begun to rip the Ottoman world apart. In 1830, they were forced to grant Greece their independence, and their control of Egypt was in little more than name alone. In 1875, Serbia, Montenegro, Wallachia, and Moldavia also declared their independence. And in 1878, the Ottomans lost control of Bulgaria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Romania. Ravaged by war, the map of the empire was being redrawn. There was a pressing need to prevent the total disintegration of the empire. This royal edict of reform is part of a movement that would change the Ottoman state forever, and it was called the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization. The Ottoman elite began to reorder its administration, but this time along Western European lines. Nowhere was this need for reorganization felt more strongly than in the military. Uniforms and artillery were bought from Britain and France. Gradually, a modern Ottoman army emerged. The Ottoman Sultanate needed to deter attack from outside forces in the east and the west, and develop highly visible symbols of central control, even in the furthest reaches of the empire. Over 1,200 kilometers from Istanbul, on the eastern flanks of Anatolia, standing on the Silk Road, near the Iranian border and facing Mount Ararat, the effect of the emerging New World Order is evident. Ishak Pasha Palace. This extraordinary fortified palace was vital to Ottoman control of these tough borderlands. It was a strategic hub in the 2-year-long territorial dispute between the Ottoman and Persian empires in the early 19th century. This palace sits at a crossroads of civilization. Its flamboyant architectural fabric reflects a fusion of Persian, Georgian, Armenian, Seljuk, Ottoman, and Western styles. Inside, it bears many of the hallmarks of a miniature Topkapi palace. Complete with law courts, harem, and a magnificent private mosque of imperial dimensions. Here, carved inscriptions of Quranic verses line the walls. Built at central government's command, Ishak Pasha Palace was closely controlled from Istanbul for almost 2 centuries. It is the ultimate symbol of Ottoman power in eastern Anatolia. Proof of Ottoman efforts to maintain even the most remote reaches of its empire. In a similar way, Ottoman central government developed close control of the sacred Hajj route in Syria. Damascus, a jewel in the Ottoman crown, reflecting the wealth of the empire. Benefiting from Far Eastern trade along the Hajj route and European trade through Eastern Mediterranean ports, Damascus became a home for a local version of Ottoman modernism.
This is very typical. It goes back to maybe the 13th century. But then around the 1830s, we start to see something new. This is what we call Ottoman Baroque, and you see a much more sort of voluptuous design, if you want, much more high relief, a three-dimensional carving, very, very busy. Ottoman Baroque is a very special part of interior design history because it's directly linked with the Ottoman Empire's attempts to modernize.
Nizam House reveals that Sultan Mahmud II's reforms had successfully improved the relationship between the palace and the provinces.
This is called Qa'at al-Inab, meaning the Hall of Grapes, because of this extensive carving in gilded stucco. It's just very crazily, ridiculously, heavily ornamented, inspired straight out of Versailles, if you like. But actually, it's coming from Istanbul.
Walls that would have been blank in a typical Damascene house were for the first time adorned with Italian-style frescoes. Istanbul had become a symbol of modernity for the whole Ottoman world.
Here we have carvings of Istanbul landscapes, a dome, a minaret. So fusing an Islamic Ottoman identity with the wealth and power of the Baroque style, which was prominent in Europe. And the Ottoman identity, if you look up at the ceiling, you immediately see the symbols of Ottoman Sultan. It's really expressing this Ottoman desire to modernize and to step up to what's happening in European culture and to be on equal footing, while also retaining its integrity and its identities in a time of a lot of crisis and pressure happening.
But, in spite of these efforts to maintain control of the empire, the economic and political axis of the world tilted west. Now, as newly industrialized European factories churned out manufactured goods, household wares, even cotton fabrics woven in Europe, started to take over the stalls in Ottoman bazaars. Gold poured out from the coffers of the empire. And countries like Britain and France began to use their economic advantage to demand more favorable trade treaties with the Ottomans. As these two worlds interacted, Ottoman culture would leave a lasting impression on the European West. The fascination with the Ottoman world was part of a rising Western academic movement, Orientalism. For the first time, translations of great Middle Eastern works such as the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and the Arabian Nights were reaching markets in the West, and their translators were European travelers. In Mortlake Cemetery in London, there is the tomb of one of the most famous Orientalist adventurers, Richard Burton, translator of the 1001 Arabian Nights.
The impact of the Arabian Nights on 18th and 19th and 20th century literature is massive. I think there is no book in the world except the Bible that had a bigger influence on British literature.
Inside the tomb are objects gathered on Burton's travels in the Ottoman-controlled Middle East.
The things we see hanging here were accumulated while he and Isabel were in Damascus when Burton was serving as consul there. He collected all sorts of stuff. These camel bells you see here were important for Burton. They had a kind of symbolic significance.
Burton made clandestine journeys to Mecca and Medina, one of the first Europeans to explore the distant and relatively unknown lands of the Hajj.
was the Royal Geographical Society that somewhat hesitantly sponsored Burton's extremely dangerous pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. It was dangerous because he was doing it in disguise. If that disguise was uncovered and he was revealed to be an infidel, he would almost certainly have been killed on the spot. I think Burton's love of the Orient is a product of his revulsion against British society, its stuffiness, its conformity, its Victorianism, its lack of adventure. He much preferred Islam to Christianity.
Burton's tales are celebrated as masterpieces of 19th century literature. But they also established an image of the Middle East as a place of intrigue and uncertainty. Artists, inspired by the likes of Burton, travelled and painted romanticised versions of the Orient. Frequently there was a sensual, dangerous side to Orientalist paintings.
I think what's fascinating about this time is that the East is either portrayed as being very, very good or very, very bad. So you have these two versions. You have the bloodthirsty Moor, the bloodthirsty Turk, and then you have this very romantic idea of this sensuous, mystical place where everything is wonderful, where the air smells sweet. This is a time of colonialism, so it's almost as if the West is saying, we are now in charge of portions of the East. We're almost unveiling it. Also, it is a very difficult place to get hold of. It does have its own mystery, and I think that's what's being realised in the painting, that even though the West is physically in many Eastern lands, it still can't quite grab the essence of what the East is.
In the real world of the Ottoman Empire, successive sultans were battling to keep their increasingly disparate peoples together. The Tanzimat reforms made a break with tradition, leaving behind the old millet system, granting the empire's minority communities, or nations, equal status with its Muslim citizens. In this imperial reform edict, Sultan Abdul-Majid I pledged that any distinction that made any of his subjects inferior to another, on account of their religion, language, or race, would be forever effaced from the administrative protocol. As their efforts to keep up with the West increased, the Ottoman Sultanate moved to a new seat of power. Today, the Turkish palace guards still protect Dolmabahce Palace. The ultimate Rococo monument, it wouldn't look out of place amongst the chateaux of France. This lavish palace represents the pinnacle of the Tanzimat era. But despite having all the trappings of a great European nation, Ottoman westernization had only touched the surface. Beneath the palace's rich facade, the limits of the Tanzimat reforms were beginning to show. The Ottoman administration's efforts had not been enough to convince each different nation that their future lay within the empire.
The Tanzimat was obviously something that started very well in the 1840s, 50s, but it's true that the Tanzimat was doomed, in a sense, because it was very difficult for an empire to really transform itself to the point of suiting the necessities and the desires, the expectations of nations, of nation-states. So it was doomed from the start in the sense that it was too complex. It was too modern, in a sense, for the structure of the Ottoman Empire.
Dolmabahce Palace is adorned with exquisitely crafted furnishings and ornaments, mostly from Europe. The centerpiece of the ceremonial hall is the world's largest Bohemian crystal chandelier, a gift from Queen Victoria of Great Britain. It dominates the room, a symbol of the influence of European powers at the very heart of the Ottoman administration. Westernization had been a very expensive process. Until 1850, the Ottoman Empire was the only empire of the age never to have contracted foreign debt. But now, the Ottoman state began to rely on European capital.
Dolmabahce Palace is a palace that speaks of power, of flaunting power. It's really the embodiment of a modern empire, or an empire that is trying to modernize. And of course, there's a cost to that. There's a price to pay. And that price is the debt, the Ottoman debt, which starts in the 1850s, more or less, with the palace. And the palace is just one drop in that enormous debt that will eventually force the empire into a formal bankruptcy in 1875.
Political reform was desperately needed if the empire was to have any hope of a future. In this room in 1876, the first Ottoman parliament was announced with great fanfare. But even this was not enough to keep the empire together. Although the Ottomans continued to modernize, once the economic and political axis of the world tilted west, it heralded the beginning of the end of Ottoman supremacy. But there was one final attempt to bring together the Islamic majority of the empire. A forgotten rail yard just south of Damascus. Once this was one of the major stopping points on the pilgrimage route to Mecca. These decommissioned old locomotives bear silent witness to an important piece of Middle Eastern history. Once cutting-edge technology, these are the original carriages and engines that transported the first Hajj pilgrims by rail in 1908. They travelled on the Hejaz Railway, a railway developed and constructed under the last Ottoman Sultan, Abdulhamid II.
Sultans and caliphs throughout the history of Muslim civilization had to protect the pilgrimage yearly trip. It was the legitimizing feature of their rule. If they protected the pilgrims, they protected the holy cities, then they were good Muslim rulers. And so what Sultan Abdulhamid did was link this sacred right with modern industry.
The railway followed the ancient trail of camel caravans, and it slashed the arduous journey time from 40 days to 4 days. The route passed via Damascus and eventually terminated in Medina. It brought much-needed innovation to the region and strengthened the Ottoman connection with key Islamic territories at a time of unrest. The railway was the embodiment of the Sultan's plan for Islamic union, bringing together Muslims not just within the empire, but beyond. 1,600 kilometers of track was laid across pitiless desert deep into the heart of Arabia and across the mountains of Hejaz. It brought together conscripts from Turkey, steel from Belgium, engineers and technology from Germany.
Sultan Abdul Hamid brought in European industrial expertise. German industry was extremely active in the construction of this railway. Over here we have an indicator, the German plaque and an Arabic plaque, so a collaboration of Ottoman and German enterprises.
But the Ottoman Empire was in debt, and the Hejaz project seemed an impossible dream. Yet remarkably, nearly a third of the cost of this vast public project was met by charitable donations. Muslims from all over the world participated in this great pan-Islamic enterprise, aimed at helping fellow pilgrims reach Mecca. When the railway line had opened for business, it transported thousands of pilgrims. But the railway also became a target. During World War I, the Hejaz route was irrevocably damaged by Allied attacks. This great Ottoman connection to the Holy Land was over. It would never go as far as Medina again. The Hejaz project had been an important achievement for the Islamic world, but it couldn't stem the tide of change. Crippled by civil strife and saddled with debt, the reign of the Ottoman dynasty was nearly over. In the aftermath of World War I, the story of one of the largest and longest-lasting empires in the world came to an end. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire had stretched from Algiers to Mosul, from Medina to the gates of Vienna. They had commanded and preserved the most dynamic region in the world. This land that from ancient times has shaped the modern world, giving it agriculture, cities, and the belief in one universal God. The land that had nurtured the brilliant minds that laid the basis of the European Renaissance. This crossroads of East and West has inspired the story of civilization for 12,000 years. It is a story that has no end.